Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 516, From the Ashes. We left things off last week with the Emperor Go-Daigo's Kenmu restoration, his attempt to return political power to the imperial family in Kyoto with the help of a collection of warriors who had become disillusioned with Hojo rule. And initially, Go-Daigo was successful. By the middle of 1333, the Hojo had been annihilated, their chosen replacement for him deposed, and a new government was emerging from the ashes. However, the Kenmu restoration would not last. Largely, it turned out, because of Go-Daigo himself. Because in terms of his actual ability to govern, Go-Daigo, it turned out, had some pretty key blind spots. Chief among them was his complete failure to recognize the importance of rewarding his followers from the warrior class. Remember, this is the main way in which fighting men are paid during this time period, so remembering to do that is, well, kind of important. These are very well-armed people who are more than happy to use those weapons, not the sort you want to try and skip out on the check with. But apparently nobody sent Go-Daigo that memo. There was, to be clear, plenty to pay the debt off with. The treasure and lands of the defeated Hojo and their allies were his to redistribute as he saw fit, after all. But Go-Daigo did not reserve much for the warriors in his ranks, focusing instead on trying to rebuild the economic power of the Kyoto aristocracy to the greatest degree possible. As the Taiheiki notes, quote, the offices of Shugo and the governor in more than 50 provinces were received by nobles and court officials. Likewise, confiscated estates and great estates were given to them until they became rich and powerful. By focusing so much on rewarding the aristocrats of Kyoto, Go-Daigo essentially ran out of cash to pay his warrior followers with. Take, for example, Akamatsu Norimura, whose name came up briefly last time. He led a rebellion in Harima province in Go-Daigo's name and jumped ship over to Go-Daigo's cause pretty early to boot. For his bravery, he was rewarded with the appointment of Shugo of Harima province for a time. Before long, Go-Daigo decided he needed to reward one of his followers at court with that title, and so stripped it from a bewildered and quite upset Akamatsu. Now this is obviously a recipe for some long-term issues, to put it mildly. It's not the sort of thing your warrior followers are likely to forget. But while Go-Daigo's mistaken priorities did practically guarantee his regime would not be stable, they didn't do much to explain where opposition to him would end up coming together. To do that, we have to return to a discussion of Ashikaga Takauji. Now again, this is very much my personal view here, but I think it's fairly clear Takauji felt no particular sense of loyalty to Go-Daigo, and had supported the imperial cause out of pure pragmatism. His actions, again, to me, make that pretty obvious. While Go-Daigo did reward him substantially, and we talked a bit about those rewards last week, Takauji never received the one thing he clearly really wanted because he asked for it over and over again. Takauji repeatedly petitioned for the title of Sei Taishogun, to be made the shogun, in other words, much as Minamoto no Yoritomo had been more than a century earlier. And I should note here that when Takauji joined the anti-Hojo rebellion, he framed that specifically as a defense of the Minamoto family, of which he was a distant descendant, rebelling in their name to end their exploitation at the hands of the Hojo, as he put it. Restoring Minamoto control, that is to say, his control of the title of shogun, flowed pretty naturally from that goal. However, Go-Daigo was not willing to give Takauji a title so associated with the very warrior rule which he hoped to end. He threw plenty of other honors Takauji's way, but not that one. Instead, he granted the role of shogun to his son, Prince Morinaga, who had continued the rebellion in his father's name after Go-Daigo's exile to the Oki Islands. Throughout much of 1334, a tense coexistence continued between Go-Daigo and Takauji. Takauji, who had been the one to take Kyoto from Hojo forces, busied himself with creating a military government to manage the city on the model of the old Hojo one, while Go-Daigo busied himself with securing his restoration. Differences certainly emerged between the two over the course of the year. For example, when Go-Daigo appointed one of his other sons, Prince Norinaga, to the east to take charge of the old Hojo headquarters at Kamakura, Takauji insisted his own brother, Ashikaga Takauji, accompany the prince to ensure his safety, more realistically to ensure that Prince Norinaga did not do anything too prejudicial to Takauji's own position or to warrior interests more generally. Similarly, by the end of 1334, Takauji was convinced the new shogun, Prince Morinaga, was planning to kill him, and, to be fair, Prince Morinaga would have been smart to do that. After Takauji's followers captured the shogun in order to end this supposed assassination attempt, Go-Daigo relented to a demand that Morinaga too be sent to Kamakura to get him out of Kyoto and thus hopefully end the tension between him and Takauji. Still, this didn't really fix the issue between Takauji and his supposed superior, the Emperor, and when the break finally did come, I can't imagine anyone was too surprised. In August 1335, remnants of the Hojo clan, which had survived the disaster of 1333, came out of hiding to attack Kamakura. Go-Daigo's forces, led by Takauji's brother Ashikaga Takauji, did their best to defend the city but were woefully outnumbered. The Hojo forces were ultimately victorious. In the confusion of the fighting, Ashikaga Takauji's charge, Prince Morinaga, was killed as the surviving Ashikaga fled the city. The most common narrative is that when Tadayoshi realized he was going to lose, he had Morinaga beheaded, lest that troublesome imperial prince survive to lead attacks against his brother in the future. When word came to Kyoto of what had happened, Takauji immediately mobilized his forces and marched to Kamakura, retaking the city very quickly and avenging his brother's defeat, and by the way, Tadayoshi did survive the battle, and that will be important in the future. Takauji then remained in Kamakura ostensibly to secure the city, but more practically to secure his own power base. For example, upon the death of Prince Morinaga, the position of shogun was now vacant. Takauji did not ask for an appointment this time, but simply proclaimed himself shogun. He also set about distributing lands taken from the defeated Hojo remnants to his followers, without asking Go-Daigo for permission. The final straw came late in 1335 when Takauji sent word to Go-Daigo that he believed another of the warriors who had supported the emperor's cause, Nitta Yoshisada, was a traitor. Nitta Yoshisada, as a quick refresher, was the final betrayer of the Hojo. After Takauji's defection, he had been the leader of the final Hojo army, and the one who decided to abandon the Hojo cause. He'd turned around and seized Kamakura in Go-Daigo's name instead. And by this time, Go-Daigo had figured out Takauji's game. The hope was clearly to get Go-Daigo's permission to remove one of the few people with enough clout and reputation to seriously challenge Takauji's own position. And so the emperor refused permission to arrest Nitta Yoshisada, and what's more, declared Ashikaga Takauji Choteki, an enemy of the imperial throne, commissioning Yoshisada and another of his followers to raise armies and crush him. Now, the war that began at this moment did not initially unfold to Ashikaga Takauji's advantage. Ashikaga forces marched swiftly towards Kyoto, defeating a force sent by his now fairly bitter rival Nitta Yoshisada in the offing, but Takauji was only able to hold Kyoto for a few days before a counterattack led by Prince Norinaga drove him from the city and from Honshu altogether. Takauji's forces were completely routed, and Go-Daigo's commanders were smart enough to place warriors to cut off his natural line of retreat east towards his home in the Kanto Plains. Instead, Takauji was forced to run west, away from his home base, and head all the way to Kyushu, far away from his allies and followers. Basically, Takauji had just lost a good chunk of his army and now was about as far from his home base as he possibly could be without swimming all the way to Korea. Things looked about as bad for him as they could look. And yet Takauji was not done, and here we see that pragmatism that to my mind defines his career so clearly. You see, during the retreat, Takauji did not just focus on getting what was left of his forces to Kyushu intact, though naturally that was concerning. He also frantically wrote letters to the warrior families of Western Japan, cutting deals as quickly as he could. Some were impressed by one of the most valuable prizes Takauji had taken away from his 4 days in Kyoto, a letter from a former emperor supporting his cause. But who would sign such a thing, going against Go-Daigo in the interests of his restoration government? Why, none other than the former emperor Kogon, the Hojo clan puppet who had been put on the throne to replace Go-Daigo after the emperor had been exiled by the Hojo. Go-Daigo in turn had deposed Kogon upon his ascent, and beyond personal dislike, remember these two emperors are from rival lines of the imperial house, because that split between the Kameyama and Go-Fukakusa branches does still exist at this point. Naturally, there was not a lot of love between Kogon and Go-Daigo, and Kogon was more than happy to throw his weight behind Ashikaga Takauji. Takauji also relied on distant ancestral ties to Minamoto no Yoritomo to claim the mantle of leadership for the entire warrior class. But he did not just rely on symbolic or traditional appeals, of course. He was, at his core, a pragmatist. Ashikaga Takauji offered the warriors of Western Japan cold, hard benefits. Every warrior family along his line of retreat heard about how Takauji would champion their interests if he came to power. Basically the same promise Minamoto no Yoritomo had made while rallying warriors against the Taira 150 years earlier. Given that much of Go-Daigo's restoration had been a deliberate attempt to wind the clock back on the gains in political and economic power which the warrior class had made, that message found a pretty receptive audience. Takauji also made some, let's call them very direct promises to the warrior families of Western Japan in exchange for their support. Given that quite a few of these families, if they had supported Go-Daigo at all, had received pretty minimal rewards for doing so, and in some cases had even lost those rewards as time went on, again, he found a pretty receptive audience. For example, remember Akamatsu Norimura, the warrior who joined Go-Daigo's cause, became Shugo of Harima Province, and then had that post taken away from him so it could be given to an aristocrat? Takauji restored him as the Shugo of Harima, and granted his sons positions as Shugo of 2 more provinces, Setsu and Mimasaka specifically. And that wasn't even the most egregious case of wheeling and dealing. He promised the position of Shugo for all 4 provinces of Shikoku to the entire Hosokawa clan for their support, basically bribing them with an entire island. Takauji also had some distant Ashikaga relatives in Western Japan. The Ashikaga were mostly an Eastern family, but sprawling polygamous family trees being what they were, there were naturally a lot of cousins to the Ashikaga out there, and a few of them had ended up in Western Japan, and were willing to hear their distant cousins' request for aid. By the 5th lunar month of 1336, Takauji had secured enough followers to begin his own march back from Kyushu towards Kyoto. Now, the most famous version of what came next is recorded in the Taiheki, the Gunki Monogatari or warrior epic dealing with this conflict. The accuracy of the Taiheki is questionable, to put it mildly, as it was written more to be an entertaining than true-to-life version of history. But this famous version is the most influential one down the line for reasons we'll get into, so it's what we're going to focus on here. Anyway, according to the Taiheki, as Takauji was retreating west, Emperor Go-Daigo was getting two different sets of advice in Kyoto. Kusunoki Masashige, his longest-standing follower, famously impressive general and just general man of daring do, was suggesting a brokered peace with Takauji now that Go-Daigo is in a better position. Takauji could be forced to give up some of his wealth and influence, and be substantially weakened as a result. Not the ideal outcome, but a sure thing. Nitayoshi Sada, longtime enemy of Takauji and also resentful of him, because both were of distant Minamoto descent, but Yoshisada's descent was more distant, told Go-Daigo, "Now is your shot to crush this man once and for all." And at this critical juncture, Emperor Go-Daigo got greedy. He decided not only to continue the war, but to march his forces out to intercept Takauji's advance. Kusunoki Masashige wanted Go-Daigo's army to abandon Kyoto and besiege Takauji within the city, rather than risk a straight fight. However, instead of this more cautious approach, Go-Daigo's army met Takauji's at Minato-gawa, more or less in the middle of Kobe City today, in the early summer of 1336. Go-Daigo's army was about equal in size to Takauji's, but crucially Takauji had won over families with substantial navies on their side, likely navies composed primarily of semi-legitimate pirates with whom these families had business dealings. Access to a fleet enabled Takauji to land part of his army behind Go-Daigo's, encircle them, and crush them. Supposedly Kusunoki Masashige knew the plan was doomed from the get-go, but was too loyal to Go-Daigo to refuse the emperor's orders, instead ordering his eldest son home in advance of the battle to continue the fight after his death. As the battle raged on, the Taiheki depicts Masashige, knowing that he is beaten, deciding to commit suicide with his most loyal followers, including his younger brother Masasue, rather than risk capture. Here's how it depicts his final moments, and here I'll be relying on the Hiroaki Sato translation. Quote, Masashige, sitting at the head of the group of warriors, turned to his brother Masasue and asked, "They say your thought at the last moment determines whether your next life is going to be good or bad. Tell me, brother, what is your wish in the 9 realms? Masasue laughed cheerfully and said, I'd like to be reborn in the human realms 7 times, that I may destroy the imperial enemy. Masashige was pleased to hear this, and said, That's a truly sinful, evil thought, but I think exactly as you do. Well then, let us be reborn the same way and realize our wish. With this vow, the 2 brothers stabbed each other and died side by side. His reputation for valor and unwavering loyalty to the imperial cause became the backbone of a Kusunoki Masashige legend. If you go to what's now the Imperial Palace in Tokyo and look in the southeast corner, you'll see a statue of a mounted samurai, the only such statue anywhere in the palace grounds. That's Masashige, who in the modern era of imperial rule became a symbol of loyalty to the imperial cause and a fixture of propaganda around service to the throne. After the crushing defeat at Minato-gawa, Nitayoshi Sada, if you're wondering, ran away when the battle was lost, Takauji was able to occupy Kyoto. Go-Daigo was forced to flee, first taking refuge with the monks of Mount Hiei and then heading south to Yoshino, in the vicinity of mountainous Nara. Takauji, meanwhile, finally got what he'd always been after. With Go-Daigo having vacated Kyoto, he reached out to the retired Emperor Kogon and arranged for Kogon to unretire and take the throne, as Emperor Komyo this time. The newly minted Emperor Komyo then granted Takauji his deepest desire, the title of shogun. We call the government of Takauji and his successors the Muromachi bakufu, Muromachi being a neighborhood and street in Kyoto where one of Takauji's successors would eventually build a giant palace for the Ashikaga shoguns. However, for a good long while after this point, the Muromachi bakufu would not govern the entire country. Go-Daigo, remember, had fled Kyoto rather than being captured. He would remain in Yoshino to the south of Nara for the rest of his life, dying in 1339 at the age of 50 and handing off power to his son, Prince Norinaga, known to history as Emperor Go-Murakami. In addition, before his death, Go-Daigo would dispatch his sons and other supporters around Japan to rally the warriors of the provinces to his cause as best they could. The result was the creation of two competing governments which divided Japan. We call this period the era of the Northern and Southern Courts, or Nanbokucho Jidai in Japanese, with the Northern Court being the Kyoto-based one under the control of the Go-Fukakusa branch of the imperial line, and run from behind the scenes by the Ashikaga shoguns. The Southern Court, so called because Yoshino is to the south of Kyoto, was the home of Go-Daigo's successors and the Kameyama branch of the imperial family, aiming to destroy the Ashikaga and take back the power they felt Takauji had usurped. Ashikaga Takauji would, in the subsequent conflict, live long enough to defeat several of his key rivals, most notably Nitayoshi Sada, who was killed in battle with Takauji's forces in 1338. But neither this nor Go-Daigo's own death stopped the conflict, which spread around Japan. In the center of the country, Kusunoki Masashige's son, Masatsura, was successful in rallying armies against the Ashikaga and keeping Takauji on the defensive. In Kyushu, one of Go-Daigo's sons, Prince Kananaga, was able to sail to Dazaifu and seize control of the administration around Hakata Bay, essentially taking control of the whole island. The 1340s would see continued sporadic fighting between the two sides, and by the tail end of the decade, cracks began to appear in the Ashikaga side as well. You see, Ashikaga Takauji was very reliant on his brother Ashikaga Tadayoshi for support, this being the same guy who had killed Prince Morinaga for him. Tadayoshi was a longtime follower of his brother and possessed substantial talents of his own. He was a careful and a skilled administrator who took the reins on the civilian side of government in Kyoto while his brother focused on the military end of things, and especially on trying to win the war with the Southern Court. However, this naturally created a divide between the two of them. Takauji, aiming to win as much support as he could, gave the warrior families which came over to his side a great deal of leeway, and in particular was extremely willing to ignore violations of property laws as they related to, say, shogun estates in the countryside, in exchange for their military support. His brother, as the head of the actual administration, was not thrilled by this notion, and the two began to clash on these and eventually other issues. Meanwhile, the Muromachi bakufu itself began to divide into factions supporting either Takauji or Tadayoshi, and, well, I bet you can guess where this is going. By 1349, Takauji got wind of a plot, and it's unclear how real this was, that his brother Tadayoshi was planning to assassinate one of Takauji's most loyal followers, Ko no Moronao. Now, Ko no Moronao is another one of those people with a hell of a historical reputation. The Taiheki depicts him as a violent, iconoclastic brute who basically fixed every problem he encountered by stabbing that problem as hard as he could until it stopped being a problem. He's depicted as a villain for his iconoclastic suggestion that the imperial throne itself wasn't even really worth all that much, and that power alone is what mattered. Which, I mean, isn't wrong, but you can't say that kind of thing. Anyway, Takauji liked Ko no Moronao quite a bit. It's very handy to have a man who enjoys stabbing things on your side. Tadayoshi, the one who had to actually, run the country, was not that fond of his brother's Mr. Fix-It running around the country, just putting a knife into anything vaguely troubling. This whole assassination plot convinced Takauji that Tadayoshi was going to betray him, and so the shogun ordered his brother stripped of all lands and titles, which immediately led to Ashikaga Tadayoshi defecting to the Southern Court, and triggering, in essence, a civil war within the Ashikaga family, the so-called Kano disturbance, because according to the Northern Court, but not the Southern one, 1350 was the first year of the Kanno era. Now, I'm not going to bother with the full blow-by-blow here, but suffice it to say that it took until 1355 for Takauji to fully suppress all the divisions within his own supporters, and by then he was getting to be an old man. Ashikaga Takauji would die in 1358, unable to see the conflicts he helped start fully to their conclusion. The war between the northern and southern courts, meanwhile, would not come to an end for almost 40 more years. It was not until the time of Ashikaga Takauji's grandson, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, that the southern court was finally beaten into submission. But in the end, Go-Daigo's attempt to restore imperial rule would come to naught. It would be the last such direct attempt for 500 years. In the end, though, Go-Daigo's Kenmu restoration does have some pretty important legacies for us. In the long term, the attempts put forward by the emperor and his followers to justify their cause would become an important part of propaganda around the imperial family going forward. The most important example is probably the Jinnol Shotoki, or Chronicle of the Authentic Lineages of the Divine Emperors, written by one Kitabatake Chikafusa, an avid supporter of Go-Daigo's and of mixed aristocratic and warrior lineage himself. Kitabatake was willing to be critical of Go-Daigo in this work, and in particular honed in on the issue of his master's failures to properly reward his samurai followers. However, he still maintained that the imperial line, due to its divine lineage as established in ancient histories like the Kojiki, which we dealt with back in episode 502, was, quote, a transcendent source of virtue in government and above criticism. The notion that the imperial line was a font of virtue and a source of legitimacy in government was, of course, a pretty big part of the propaganda legitimating the southern side of the war effort, and in the future it would be taken up by defenders of the imperial cause and become a central part of nationalistic propaganda around the emperor and throne. You still see these ideas repeated in some sectors of the Japanese far right today. On the Ashikaga side, meanwhile, you have works like the Kenmu Shikimoku, a code of government proclaimed by Takauji in 1336 as he was attempting to shore up support, or the 1357 Toji-in Goisho, or Testimony at Toji-in, traditionally ascribed to Takauji, but almost certainly ghostwritten by someone else. These texts are way more pragmatic in their defense of Ashikaga rule, outlining a Confucian notion that the state is not the property of any one person or family, not even the emperor's. Instead, it is the duty of all who would rule to promote the interests of the state and especially peace and stability. The Kyoto court, the claim was, had failed to do this. Now it was the turn of the samurai class to step in and do it for them. Of course, in Takauji's time, the idea that he represented a return to stability would have been a hard sell, I think, but it's certainly true that his successors had more luck in that regard. The height of Ashikaga rule in particular is most associated with Takauji's grandson Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who was shogun from 1368 until his death in 1408. His 40 years in office saw the war with the southern court finally end in decisive victory for the northern side, as well as a huge push to bolster the legitimacy of the Muromachi bakufu. For example, Yoshimitsu was the one who ordered the construction of the Hana no Gosho, or Palace of Flowers, which became the home of the Ashikaga shoguns along Kyoto's Muromachi Dori, which is why we call the government the Muromachi bakufu. The Palace of Flowers was twice the size of the one that his grandfather had built for the emperors in Kyoto as a gesture of patronage, a marker of the power of the Ashikaga family. Yoshimitsu was also the one who built himself a massive retirement villa in Kitayama north of Kyoto proper. Like many an elite courtier in this time, he'd inherited an interest in Rinzai sect Zen, which had been popularized among the elite during the Hojo years. Thus, after his death, the whole complex was transformed into a temple to pray for his salvation. Today, it's known as Kinkakuji, one of the most famous sites in modern Kyoto. Beyond these physical examples of a push for legitimacy, Yoshimitsu spent a great deal of time and energy laying claim to the status markers of the old aristocracy, hoping, in essence, to make the Ashikaga a part of that aristocracy. Like many of the Kyoto aristocracy, he patronized the arts, especially arts from China, and worked hard to climb the hierarchy of court families, capping out in 1394 by receiving the position of Daijō Daijin, Prime Minister of the old civilian government, a title to go along with his position as shogun. Yoshimitsu broadly seems to have understood that combining these older systems of courtly power with his role as the head of a military house and his title of shogun would give him a lot of legitimacy as a ruler and make him less reliant on pure force to see his dictates obeyed. Which was a clever strategy and very successful in its time, but today Yoshimitsu is not remembered quite as fondly. He's remembered more for being the only ruler in Japanese history to take the fateful step of accepting nominal subordination to China. In 1402, Yoshimitsu accepted a letter of investiture from the Emperor of China, Yongle, part of a new dynasty called the Ming, which had overthrown Mongol rule a few decades back. That letter marked him as a tributary of China's emperor, accepting nominal subordination in exchange for trade, the first ruler to accept that role since the founding of what became the Japanese state back in the murky past. Yoshimitsu almost certainly did this for the trade privileges attached to a tributary position, and because practically speaking it made very little difference day to day. But today he's remembered with great scorn by Japanese nationalists for choosing to accept even nominal subordination. Anyway, Yoshimitsu's whole political balancing act was clever, but his successors proved unable to maintain it. And here we get probably to the most important legacy of Ashikaga Takauji and his war to seize control of the government, the compromises he had to offer in order to win. Early in his career, Takauji was able to rely primarily on existing retainers and on relatives from branches of the Ashikaga family, the wider clan network, in other words, of relatives flung throughout the provinces. But Takauji was eventually forced to cast his net a bit wider, first because of the demands of the war itself, and second because his attempts to set up a new bakufu in Kyoto bumped him up against existing powerful warrior families who had to be appeased and brought over to his cause. Takauji was thus forced to create new powerful vassals by rewarding his followers, and to cut deals with entrenched Shugo families. We've covered the example of the Akamatsu family already, who by jumping ship to Takauji's cause, ended up as the Shugo of 3 different provinces, and they're a good example of that first type. The Akamatsu family of Suo province in western Japan, and the Shimazu of southern Kyushu are an example of that second type, entrenched families who Takauji brought over to his cause by promising to entrench them further. Takauji also granted his Shugo substantially expanded powers, most notably the ability to collect taxes on their own initiative, a big departure from previous practice because remember, tax collection is supposed to be the job of the civilian Kokushi governor, not the military Shugo one. Simply put, Takauji began to tip the balance of provincial government to be less balanced, I guess, and more directly in favor of the warrior side of things. And to be clear, I don't know that we can say he was wrong to do this. These choices are a big part of what convinced large segments of the samurai class to follow the Ashikaga, thus enabling them to eventually win. But it also meant Takauji's successors had to deal with extremely powerful vassals out in the provinces, including Shugo families with massive landholdings. The Ouchi family, for example, ended up as the Shugo of 6 provinces during their height, and they were not even the biggest of the Shugo families. And this, in the end, had some very important consequences. The power of the Ashikaga shoguns was variable, as a result of both their location in Kyoto and these compromises. Their control was greatest in central Japan, in the area around Kyoto itself, but for example, western Japan was mostly the domain of powerful Shugo families. The Kanto plains of the east, meanwhile, were a persistent issue. Takauji attempted to set up one of his sons as a sort of deputy shogun in the Kanto. Kanto Kubo was the official title, the idea being that a branch of the Ashikaga could manage the east on the shogun's behalf, with the help of the Uesugi family, Takauji's maternal family that had a lot of landholdings in the area. It was a nice theory, but the reality was that this eastern branch of the Ashikaga would clash constantly with the main branch of the Ashikaga, and the Uesugi would eventually just become completely independent as a power on their own in the east. Similarly, the northernmost part of Honshu, the so-called Oo area, home to the 2 provinces of Mutsu and Dewa, was a constant issue to deal with. Takauji sent 2 of his trusted generals, Hatakeyama Kuniuji and Kurasada Ie, to keep the region under control, the hope being to avoid letting this remote area become a safe haven for his enemies. Unfortunately, these 2 men hated each other and spent more time fighting each other than enemies of the shogun, a problem Takauji and his successors could do little about. Similarly, despite appointing a series of trusted vassals to the position of Chinsei Tandai, deputy of Kyushu in essence, Takauji and his successors were not really able to control the island, which remained home to independent-minded shugo who cooperated with the bakufu when it was convenient for them. The Muromachi bakufu emerged from a series of wartime compromises, and as a result it was never really a stable government. The shoguns of the Ashikaga house were very dependent on the goodwill of the shugo to actually control anything outside of the center of the country. Clever shoguns who were adept diplomats, like Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, could manage this alright, using a combination of their intelligence and charisma to maintain the delicate balance and keep things functional. Future shoguns would not always be that clever, and that would provide independent-minded shugo with a chance to push back against the shogunate. The balance of power would hold for a time, but in less than a century the whole facade would crumble, resulting not in another shift, but in the complete and total destruction of that balance. But that is for the future. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House Is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time as we talk about the various ways this delicate balance continues to crumble.